Please subscribe to help you and your motorcycle perform better.
Dave Williams, editor here with today's video. A deeper dive into our comparison between the Aprilia RSV4 1100 factory and the Ducati V4S. More specifically, we're going to dive into the electronic control systems of these bikes. We're also going to discover one of the first major failures, the first major detriments, the first major issues with one of these bikes that really puts it on the back foot compared to the other. From a deeper dive perspective, we can see that Ducati, at first glance, wins the comparison on economy of name. Ducati V4S versus Aprilia RSV4 1100 factory. Ducati wins that battle.
I've owned multiple Ducatis and Aprilias in the past, so I've always been a fan of them. When this thing came out, super excited. V4 1100, fantastic. Kind of out of the playing field. No other bike could compare to power-wise. When this came out, it just made sense to get one to do a proper head-to-head comparison, and more importantly, doing a test which is more resolved than the ones you see in magazines and the ones you see typical multi-bike shootouts, which simply can't be done properly when you have so many bikes and a limited amount of time. So my idea was to get the best people in the business, yourself and others, and help me develop a true multi-part shootout between these bikes, which cover all the bases from street use, track use, rideability, build quality, pretty much every aspect we can kind of cover. I want to cover thoroughly and make it a really a benchmark for all future testing that we'll do in the future on our YouTube channel. I used to be an automotive journalist, my previous profession, 10, 15 years ago. I remember having to fill words. Yes, you wanted to make them insightful and entertaining, but at the end of the day, when you're given a task to fill this many pages with words, your brain thinks differently. It works on, it starts brain dumping for the purpose of brain dumping, not for the purpose of content. We simply can't condense it down to a 2,000 word comparison test. And then when you factor in how much work is involved with setup and to make sure each bike is performing at its best ability for any given rider at any given track, that's like a whole story in itself. That is not a small thing. What we've learned in the last few days has really driven that point home to me. How these tests simply cannot, all those multi-bike shootouts in magazines are inherently flawed. Because none of the bikes, Dave, if you go to take the last spot bike, spend a lot of time setting it up, and someone has a first spot bike, which is kind of set up and not so well, the results will change. Change riders, the results will change. Every rider is going to ride differently and like a different bike setup based upon his weight and size and whatnot. Well, the Ducati I've had for almost a year, so I've done a little bit more work to it. This bike just has, basic ergonomic stuff done to it. I put on rear sets on it simply because the stock rear sets, they're limited as far as ground clearance. The bike is very comfortable. The downside is it's turn 3 at Thunder Hill, you can scrape pegs, right? The seat is not stock. It is their comfort seat, which just looks nicer, nice texture than their standard seat. What else? That's it. Oh, engine covers. It was interesting. The Aprilia already comes with a lot of this stuff. It comes with engine covers. You don't have to spend a few $100 on them. It comes with rear sets which have a ton of ground clearance. Downside is a little bit more cramped for the legs. All I got was tank grips, fender eliminator, integrated tail light. I put a hanger there to get rid of the rear passenger pegs. And, both bikes have taller windscreens for the track. Yes, my company specializes in ECU tuning products for various vehicles, both cars and bikes. Our signature product is the OpenFlash tablet. It is a handheld ECU tuning device which stores tune files in there. Customer receives it, they plug it in the bike, it reads the ECU, it automatically generates tune files, and they can choose which tune file they want to run. In certain applications, it also offers data logging and real-time digital gauge display information, enhanced diagnostics. We have them available for Aprilia, Ducati, KTM, some BMWs, and we're always developing new applications as time goes on. Well, in the marketplace, there's a few different ways of tuning these ECUs. One is remapping the ECU, reflashing the ECU, same thing, and the other one is adding like a power command or a Brazaz unit or some sort of interceptor / piggyback device. On modern bikes, the interceptor piggyback devices really don't work very well. They can provide basic fuel trimming and basic timing tweaks, but they don't address things like rev limit hysteresis, fan control, open loop, closed loop fuel transitions, torque limiters. You can't remap the throttle. You can't change engine braking characteristics. You can't do this on a per gear, or not only can you not do it, but then you can't do it on a per gear or a per riding mode basis as we can. So as bikes have gotten more clever, just like with cars that have been clever for a very long time, bikes are kind of catching up to them. It doesn't make sense adding piggybacks anymore. Earlier in my career, we developed really advanced piggybacks for vehicles, but they just don't work on new cars. There are too many internal diagnostics, too many plausibility checks. Same thing with bikes now. You're getting to the point where if you start making a tuning change on a bike, you'll throw a check engine light for misfire or for crank angle sensor. You have these computers now on bikes which control everything on the bike. When you add another computer talking with it and faking inputs and outputs, things are bound to go wrong. So now it just makes sense remapping the computer, changing the tables in the computer, as opposed to trying to fool the computer into doing things clearly it's not intended to do. When I first got the bike, it was a handful. It was fun, exciting. It was super impressive on the street. On the track, the front was soft, and it would dive a lot. It would lift a lot under power. It would feel a little disconnected. I talked to you about that, and you had already done a bunch of work on this bike, or doing some testing on him, and then you advised me to do thicker fork oil, which would kind of make everything stiffer and change the adjustment range, essentially. And that helped. It allowed us to get the damping to where we needed to be and get reduced squat, and big difference.
So as far as the test goes, realistically, other than stock suspension, the only difference really that we have to declare is that the forks have thicker oil in them.
And to me, if anyone's going to be spending a $30,000, $32,000 out the door on a bike, it would be ridiculous to think that they wouldn't do a couple $100 change like that to get the most out of it. We didn't want to entertain things like power upgrades and all that, but for things like that, I think it's fair to allow.
Boom goes the dynamite. There it is. The front end of the V4S is too soft out of the box. Off the showroom floor, once you start to push the pace much beyond casual street riding, the front end cannot cope. And the first step is to put heavier oil in it. The RSV4, on the other hand, is much sturdier out of the box. All the componentry is ready to go and take the bike to a much higher performance level before you have to start monkeying with the componentry. And that's a huge benefit.
About 36,000 miles on this one. 100 miles. 3,600 miles on this one. This one, a few hundred miles. They both have fresh oil during the tests. I did a break-in on this on the dyno. Very controlled break-in, changed oil after that, and then did one more change after that. And I've done a bunch of dyno testing on this bike, comparing it to a bunch of Ducati press bikes. We had 3 at a time, and we did them all testing, and they're all within 1 or 2 horsepower of each other. So this is not weaker, it's not stronger, it's right where it needs to be. I've done some testing on the dyno with this bike. We don't have a product release for it. I wanted to wait till all the testing was done and do the a part 4 test, which has compares them again on the dyno when them fully kitted out with racing pipes and tunes. The biggest thing that this bike benefits from when you remap it is you change the logic for the quick shifter. It reduces the kill time between shifts, because right now when you and you shift, it's got that dead spot. Like, it's very short, but it kind of upsets the chassis and it's kind of surprising. We shortened that down to make that as seamless as this guy. Power-wise, you can also pick up a good amount of power with these bikes too. They leave some on the table for you, especially when you start adding racing pipes on it as well. We've dynoed both bikes. I've done some preliminary tuning on this bike, but again, for the sake of testing, I've kept it all stock. This thing made a few horsepower more than the Ducati, and it was just beautiful. It sounded wonderful, linear power band. Ended up making 208 at the wheels versus this thing made 202. The Ducati had more low-end torque, more mid-range, a little bit, not as linear, not a little bit, I don't want to say lumpy, because lumpy would do it a disservice.
Right.
Not as perfectly smooth as this, but still very smooth. Both exceptional on the dyno. Both of the most powerful bikes I've ever tested stock on the dyno.
Okay, and then for the last piece of the background, what engine electronics settings did you bring the bikes to the track with?
We kept, they all ran in the race modes, which means that the least intrusive ABS, the least intrusive traction control. This had the most aggressive slide control setting. Engine braking was minimal on this, and the mode we rode in was also minimal on this. They were comparable. Wheelie control on both bikes was not very aggressive, meaning allowed some wheelies. We try, they're different, but we try to keep them as, parity with each other.
Right, and the purpose of the test is here's the bike.
Yeah.
And then we've got to fit it to the rider in the way they ride and their skill and ability anyway. So
Absolutely.
settings were bound to change, which is the whole reason for the test.
And those tests that don't change those settings, which makes me highly question the results they come up with, right? I mean, some of the changes we made were profound. Like, I remember Pat was telling you the bike does this, 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 and it almost sounded like he didn't like it, at least that part of it. And then you make some tweaks, and he came back saying, oh, I love it. So, I mean, if a change can make the difference between disliking and loving a bike, how do you reconcile that with all the other tests that, do they do the same amount of testing, the same amount of changes? Do they do the same amount of adjustments per the rider feedback? I doubt it, Yeah, and you don't know the skill level of the rider, right? I mean, Pat and you are much more skillful than I am on the track. I'm a quick A group rider, but you guys are professional level, so it's not, your setup is going to be vastly different than mine. Simple as that. All right, use this little toggle button here to scroll through to settings, hit enter, riding modes, and on the track I use the sport setting for the track. Mm-hmm. And that's the various things you can control, ABS, engine braking, quick shifter, info mode, and there's Ducati electronic suspension. Select that. So here are the settings we had. We ran in custom fixed mode. You have multiple choices, dynamic suspension, custom dynamic. We ran custom fixed. Select that. And here is the front compression. The setting is 22.
Out of?
Out of, good question. 32.
Okay.
Put that back. Back. Front rebound, 14 out of 32. Rear compression, 24 out of 32. Rear rebound, 20 out of 32. Steering damper, 12 out of, I don't know.
Let's find out.
19. And that is it for suspension, for fixed suspension.
Right, so the interesting point there is, if we hadn't changed that thicker oil, fork rebound setting may have been a different number.
Off the chart.
The thing to point out now is what is maximum and what is minimum in terms of numbers.
Okay.
So is 0 maximum or is 22 maximum? So that's one thing. Does the menu tell you that? No, it doesn't. It just gives you a series of numbers. So
it just tells you stiffer, more comfortable, more aggressive, or it just gives you a range.
So the bottom line there is when you change the settings, we didn't know how much travel was actually going to be accessed because the number is a number.
Correct.
So if we make a logical assertion, we went with thicker oil, we're down in getting towards single numbers. Obviously 0 is going to be maximum and 22 is going to be nothing.
Right.
So one of the assertion points there is a problem with that. So now let's switch out and go to race mode and see what we have in race mode as a comparison.
The same. Race mode shares the same suspension.
Right. So there's something that you can explain why they are repeated and how they are repeated between modes, right? Because everybody's going to think you have to program each mode, each setting.
You basically can define, you have 4 different suspension options. You have, I'll show you. You have fixed suspension, which is the default settings that it comes with. Custom fixed, which is the settings that you can adjust, which you did for us. Dynamic suspension, which is the standard, and then custom dynamic, which is the deviation from the standard, which you can kind of dial in. And then for each riding mode, you can select one of these, right? You can select dynamic or fixed. And
so if we get out of that menu and go right back to the start,
okay.
And then if we hold it down, we go to a different submenu, right? So if we go all the way back. Yeah.
Oh, I see. Hold it down.
If we hold it down, now it gives us another menu.
Correct. Now we can change between the race, sport, and street. And in each setup, it tells us what exactly our values are. In this case, the street setting has dynamic suspension. The sport setting has fixed suspension. And the race also has fixed suspension. And it also outlines your traction control settings, your ABS settings, your wheelie control, your slide control, your engine braking settings, and your quick shifter settings in each way.
So you've got 2 ways to do that.
Correct.
You can go the long way all the way through it, but once you set, fixed is set for fixed, whether it's custom or fixed.
Correct.
And the difference with dynamic is the ECU makes the decisions, we don't.
Correct. We just define whether we want more support, less support in different points in the corner. Dynamic suspension adjusts damping on the fly depending on, I guess, shock travel and shock velocity and wheel speed and lean angle. It makes a lot of clever decisions. Presumably clever decisions. On the street, it's nice because you're not at full lean, you're not doing all this stuff, and you just marvel in the comfort it has while still giving good brake support and acceleration support.
And the thing that we've seen of late is it was 100 decisions a second, then 120, then 140, and that is cycling upwards and upwards and upwards, and the beauty of the street is no 10 feet of pavement is the same.
Exactly.
So having it running dynamic and then change custom dynamic will give you a quality of ride on the road that you could never get.
Never get.
Because you'd be adjusting suspension every 10 feet.
No, it's a massive improvement. Going from being my first bike with electronic suspension and being a good electronic suspension, unlike the first generation ones, which weren't all that great on the BMW, right?
Right.
It was very eye-opening on how you can get a super bike to be, I hate saying the word comfortable, but almost comfortable, on the street. You don't have a death grip on the bars because you're being bounced around. The level of fatigue that you save yourself from is remarkable when you have it properly dialed in.
All right, so getting into the fact that you use dynamic for the road and fixed for the track, why don't you walk us through both of those, because there is a limitation there.
Yeah. Basically, you have, I'll show you. In the dynamic suspension, you can define your fixed suspension settings and your dynamic suspension settings. So you basically have 2 options. You have your fixed and dynamic setup. In the 3 riding modes, you can pick any one of those 2 options. You cannot have 2 unique dynamic setups or 2 unique fixed setups. It sounds limiting, but in reality, I've never found the need for that, because on the street, I use my nice dynamic setup, which is a little more plush, a little more comfortable. And on the track, I use the fixed setting, which is more traditionally set up.
Right.
And it's just consistent. I feel that it has slightly more, less lap-to-lap variability. sometimes it just behaves like I want it to behave. Not to say that the dynamic was bad. When I rode in dynamic mode on the track, I found it really nice too, but we're really splitting hairs here.
Right.
Yeah.
So the important thing to remember, especially in regards to this, is when you select race or sport, the fixed values that you put in originally transfer straight across.
Exactly.
So you cannot have sport fixed values and race different fixed values.
Correct. You can just choose between fixed or dynamic, and that's it.
So the thing to remember about this and the limitation is, as you improve, you've got to change your fixed values.
Yeah.
And that's based on how comfortable you get with the bike.
Correct.
And your riding style. But outside of that, if you use custom dynamic, then that will apply in race and sport.
Correct.
As well. So.
Okay, so then what's the difference between race and sport?
The race and sport controls many other things other than suspension. It controls traction control, slide control, wheelie control, engine braking. You can the suspension is only one small variable in this setup, in each setup. In the race setting, you can see I have traction control set to 3, ABS set to 1, wheelie control set to 1, slide control set to 1, engine braking control set to 2, and then I have upshifter and downshifter both enabled, and electric suspension set to fixed. In sport mode, I have, let's look at the difference. It's more forgiving. It's got higher wheelie control threshold. It has a less aggressive ABS setting. It has, let's see, a less aggressive slide control setting, but it also uses the same fixed setup. On the street, I have higher traction control setting, meaning less racy.
Yep.
And I have, but it runs in dynamic suspension setting, which is more comfortable.
Now, the one thing we can't see there is engine power.
Yes.
So, based on those modes, in that summary, we don't get to see it. So, what's the difference in horsepower output per mode?
There are a couple different settings you can use for three engine output settings, and I will show you what they are. In each setting, you can define which engine setting you want, in each street, race, or track. So there's low, medium, and high. Let's start low again. Low has reduced power, which makes about 120 on the dyno, so it drops power by like 80 horsepower.
Yeah,
Still pretty quick. And it has a very smooth, reduced power with a very smooth throttle response. Medium setting makes full power but retains that smooth throttle response, meaning it almost like smoothens out rough inputs. So it applies like a slew rate limiter for throttle opening. So you're never, even if you do whack, it doesn't open up the throttle, whack. It kind of slowly opens it up. Still super responsive, but, and it makes sense because the one day I tried full throttle mode, which makes the throttle opening follow your hand input identically. It was just a monster to.
So it's 1-for-1 on the throttle.
Yeah,
and race.
I don't know if it's 1-for-1. It might be mapped differently, but it doesn't have any limiter function, meaning it doesn't have any thing that limits the rate of opening, throttle opening. Okay. So if your hand slips or if you do any kind of motion, it will actually just knock you off your bike. I remember once, and that's a big issue on rough roads, right? When rough roads, you're moving around, all of a sudden now and then it starts moving around, and then it starts moving you around, and it gets worse and worse, right? It's this oscillatory effect. So putting in smooth mode, I've never deviated from smooth mode on a bike this powerful. You're this world where you have 200+ horsepower bikes would make a lot of torque. It's not like it was 5 years ago, where you could maybe deal with that, but not anymore.
All right, so key on. Here we go. And Shiv will walk us through this menu, because all the toggle buttons are completely different.
Yes, gotta wait for that stupid little sign to go away. It always happens, I don't know why. It's simpler than Ducati. There's no sub-menus really. There is one down here, which you can adjust your APRC settings, your ABS, traction control, wheelie control, launch control, quick shifter. You can adjust all that. And then you can also do APRC configurations, which you can adjust your pit limiter, which is funny. You can do tire calibration, you can pair with your phone, etc. And then you have a lap timer, you set your shift light, And what is that? Good question. Configuration. Oh yeah, your usual clock and language and
Right.
scaling, whatnot. And then you can also adjust some stuff real time, which is kind of cool. While you're riding, you can adjust traction control. You can see it up and down. So on the track, real time, which is nice. And then if you come to a stop, you can make some changes to the wheelie control, launch control, and ABS without having to go into the sub menu. But you have got to do it when the bike has come to a stop. So you select ABS, turns red, you can go up, increase it to 3, down to 2, down to 1, and hit it again. Same thing with wheelie control and launch control and traction control.
Okay, so what settings did we have for the test?
Good question. Okay, so for my test or for Pat's test? My test. We kept the traction control on 3, wheelie control on 2, ABS on 2, launch control I never use, it's arbitrarily set at 3. Middling aggressive, not super aggressive settings for me on a track as technical and as unforgiving as Sonoma seemed like a good idea.
Right. Does this have race, sport? What modes do we have for power output?
Yes, you have a couple. Power output's all going to be the same. They're all going to be max power. Where they do change is throttle mapping and engine braking.
Okay.
You'll find there are a few different settings you can toggle through. You can press and hold that. Oh, sorry. Press and hold that. No, I don't know. Press and hold.
Do we need the motor running?
No.
No. Okay.
You're gonna edit this part out, right?
No.
No? Okay.
Because this is what I'll be doing.
All right.
It's just the same thing.
Let's just
right?
try starting it. I think they might need it running.
So in gear.
Press and hold. Oh, okay. Double click almost. Okay.
So that's good. We know because
now we know.
everybody's going to run into this problem. So we give them the real world.
And these are controlled by this.
By the same button you use to start the engine, to crank it over, you can use to, I guess, press. Oh, yeah, you got to do the engine running. Otherwise, the car starts, the bike starts. So yeah, you hold it, let go, and then you can go between sport, track, and race. Each one's going to have different throttle mapping and more importantly, different engine braking characteristics. The more racy ones will have less engine braking than the street one.
How are they achieving less engine braking?
Well, engine braking is defined in the throttle tables, right? So depending on if you have a closed twist grip, meaning you're applying your throttle with your hand, that doesn't necessarily mean the throttle is closed all the way. You can have the actual throttle butterfly valve still be open a little bit. The more open they are, the less engine braking effect you have. So yeah, we can change that with the flasher, but Aprilia does a pretty good job of it from the factory.
So the difference there is it's done by secondaries versus clutch.
Correct.
So this is done via ECU on fuel management and throttle position.
Mostly the opposite.
Yeah. Otherwise, you can go get a slipper clutch and do it the old school way.
Yes, correct.
Okay.
The different engine modes will have different relationship between twist grip and actual throttle opening. On the track settings and more racy settings tend to be more linear. They're not going, whereas a street setting the sport setting is going to be more aggressive because to make the bike feel torquier and more responsive on the street. That same response you like and enjoy on the street, passing someone, merging, becomes twitchy on the track. On the track, you want something more linear and consistent. You don't mind opening up more to make more power, but you want to be able to maintenance throttle things, which are harder to do in the sport setting, which is more, more responsive?
Sure,
Yeah.
that's a much more appropriate word.
Yeah.
And one of the things I find when we go down in the power is it'll surge.
Okay. Yeah.
Because you might hold that and try and hold it still, but you actually can't.
Very small motions.
Really hard, so you get a surge of 500, down 300, up 5. So when you go to the track settings, what you're putting in is what you are going to get.
Exactly. Because on the street, you're never leaned over all the way. You're never doing maintenance throttle for more than a couple seconds, or if that.
Right.
So yeah, less of an issue on the street.
Schedule a remote tuning appointment for you and your bike with Dave via text, email, Facebook, etc. Contact Dave on Facebook or by email, dave@davemosstuning.com.